I didn't mean to do it.
They didn't scream. They didn't ask for help. They didn't cry in public. What scared the police wasn't what June and Jennifer said. It was the fact that they didn't say anything to anyone except each other, and even then in a language that no one could fully understand. The initial police reports don't mention violence. They mention strangeness. Two teenagers involved in minor incidents, always together, always motionless when separated, as if someone had switched something off inside them. The report uses one word repeatedly: inaccessible. When officers tried to speak to one of them individually, there was no response. Fixed gaze, tense body, no reaction. But simply placing them face to face was enough to change something. Not comfort, activity, a kind of life that only existed in that minimal space between the two. The police didn't know how to record it. It wasn't a challenge to authority. It wasn't fear. It wasn't common clinical mutism. It was an absolute refusal of the outside world. And the more they insisted, the clearer it became. Their silence wasn't empty. It was organized, consistent, resilient. And the police realized too early that they were dealing not with two silent people, but with a closed communication system that didn't accept interference. The first psychologists called in to evaluate June and Jennifer arrived with a simple objective: to make them talk. That was the initial mistake. No one asked why the silence existed. The question was simply how to break it. Clinical reports show long sessions full of stimuli, tests, attempts at gradual separation. The result was always the same. When separated, the two entered an almost catatonic state. They didn't react to mild pain, hunger, or the presence of strangers. It was as if their consciousness depended on their proximity to each other. The police, pressured by minor offenses committed by the two girls, began registering incidents that would normally end in warnings. In their case, each event became a dossier, not out of malice, but because no one knew where to categorize them. The system responds to what it doesn't understand, with paperwork. One of the most disturbing records describes how, during an interrogation, an officer tried to provoke a reaction by raising his voice. No response. But when one of them was removed from the room, the other immediately collapsed physically. Tremors, falling to the ground, irregular breathing. The silence had a cost. The professionals began to disagree among themselves. Some advocated for harsher intervention. Others warned that the symbiosis between the two was not a whim, but a complex psychological structure. Even so, the institutional decision was clear. They needed to be normalized. And here lies the central flaw: treating something rare as if it were merely a behavioral deviation. From that moment on, every action of the state, even well-intentioned, began to push June and Jennifer towards a dead end. When the professionals finally gave up trying to get them to talk, something unexpected happened. June and Jennifer started writing. Not for therapists, not for the police, for each other. Diaries, short stories, improvised plays, all written at a fast, almost obsessive pace. The texts weren't childish. They were dense, sometimes violent, full of trapped, suffocated characters, observed by external forces. The detail that most startled the experts was the internal coherence. The stories connected. They had continuity. It was a closed universe, as if the two were building a parallel world where only they were allowed to enter. Linguistic analyses revealed something rare. When they wrote separately, their style was almost identical. Same metaphors, same structure, same cadence. It wasn't conscious imitation. It was as if they were accessing the same mental source. In some passages, phrases emerged that left the evaluators uneasy. One of us needs to disappear so that the other can live. Not as a threat, as a cold observation, written weeks before any official separation. No authority knew what to do with it. The police gained access to part of these writings, and for the first time the reports changed tone. They no longer spoke only of silence. They spoke of psychological intensity. something that wasn't dangerous in itself, but that became unstable when pressured. And here's the point you should narrate without dramatizing. Those texts were coded cries for help. But no one was trained to read help when it didn't come in the form of tears or confession. The separation didn't come as punishment, it came as treatment. The reports are clear. It was believed that separating June and Jennifer would allow each to develop her own identity. In theory, it made sense. In practice, it ignored everything that previous records had already shown. On the first day apart, both stopped responding completely. They didn't speak, they didn't write, they didn't react to basic stimuli. One of them spent hours staring at the wall without blinking. The other refused to eat. The silence, which had previously been selective, became absolute. Staff recorded something unsettling. It was as if the vital energy had been switched off. There was no resistance, no rebellion, just absence. The professionals noted this in technical language, but the subtext was clear. This didn't seem like treatment. The police ceased to be the protagonists and became supporting actors. Now it was doctors, therapists, and administrators making decisions. The case moved from the legal field to the institutional one. And when that happens, the focus shifts from the person to the protocol. An excerpt from an internal report states that regression was expected. This phrase summarizes the error. It wasn't regression, it was collapse. But collapse doesn't fit well into a standard form. And here you look at the viewer and leave the question implicit. If someone only functions in relation to another person, is separation a cure or amputation? The institutionalization wasn't presented as punishment, it was described as protection. Protection from the world, from themselves, from general incomprehension. But in practice, it meant one simple thing. June and Jennifer stopped making any decisions. The institutional records change tone at this point. The words become colder, more standardized. The two cease to be described as individuals and begin to be treated as a joint case. Even when physically separated, they continued to be seen as a single problematic entity. Within the institution, the silence was no longer observed with clinical curiosity. It was expected, almost desired. Staff recorded entire days without any verbal or written response, as if this were progress. The system learns quickly to adapt to what it doesn't understand. It normalizes. A detail that almost no one comments on appears in secondary reports. When placed back in the same environment, even without direct interaction, vital signs and responsiveness improved. Nothing dramatic, just enough to show that the connection had never been broken, only repressed. During this period, records of mild self-destructive behaviors emerge, not as explicit cries for help, but as attempts to sense something. Small gestures ignored because they didn't fit emergency criteria. Silence protects the system from having to act. And here's the hardest part. Institutionalization didn't solve the problem of silence. It only made it convenient. Silence is easy to manage. It doesn't question, it doesn't complain, it doesn't demand answers.
There is no clear document stating what would happen next. There is no formal order nor a conclusive record. What exists is a sequence of small administrative changes that together form an irreversible decision. June and Jennifer would be kept separated indefinitely. This choice was not presented as punishment nor as a new treatment. It was sold as continuation of the plan. This expression appears more than once in the records. Continuity, when no one can explain the ultimate goal, is merely institutional inertia. Professionals began to notice something that did not appear in the charts, a kind of silent agreement between the two. Even separated, even without direct contact, it was as if both knew that something needed to happen for it to end. It wasn't said, it wasn't written, but it was felt. A clinical report describes a subtle but decisive change. One of the twins began to show signs of resignation, less resistance, less tension. The other, on the contrary, seemed to carry an increasing weight, as if she were holding something that no longer fit between two people. Here comes the part you should narrate in a low voice without dramatic effect. The professionals perceived the change but didn't understand its meaning. They saw improvement where there had been preparation. They saw adaptation where there had been farewell. In retrospect, some experts admit that this was the most dangerous phase, not because there was chaos, but because there was too much calm. And when a complex case becomes calm without a real solution, it's usually not progress. It's closure. The news was recorded dryly. One of the twins died shortly after a change in institutional regime. There was no public alarm. There was no press conference, just one line in a medical report and another in an administrative record. The system did what it knows best when something gets out of control: close the case. Officially, there were no guilty parties, no direct action, no proven negligence, but those who followed the records knew that this didn't come out of nowhere. The death was not an isolated event. It was the last step in a long process of psychological compression. The detail that almost never appears in quick summaries is the immediate effect on the surviving twin. For the first time since childhood, she began to speak to people outside that closed circle. Short sentences, low voice, but real words directed at the world. This left many professionals disconcerted. Some interpreted it as belated progress. Others, more cautious, saw it as confirmation of what was already implicit in ancient writings. For one to exist in the outside world, the other needed to disappear, not as a desire, as a psychic structure distorted by the wrong intervention. No in-depth investigation was opened to connect institutional decisions to the outcome. The case was already too complex, too old, too uncomfortable. Closing it seemed safer than reviewing protocols, admitting failures, or revising diagnoses. And here is the part you should let echo in the silence of the video. The system registered the end as a biological fact, but never confronted the human fact, because confronting that would require admitting that the silence wasn't the problem, the way of dealing with it was. When the case was officially closed, the records began to treat it as something from the past, a rare event, a set of difficult circumstances, a problem without a perfect solution. This is the language institutions use when they want to move forward without looking back. But June and Jennifer's story didn't end there. It continues every time a system tries to forcibly correct what it doesn't understand, every time silence is treated as a defect, not a signal, every time someone decides that adaptation is worth more than listening. What makes this case disturbing is not the extreme bond between two sisters. It's the fact that no one stopped to ask what that bond sustained. They tried to break it before understanding it, and when they realized the mistake, it was too late to go back. If you pay attention, you'll notice that police and medical records never mention malice. They talk about procedure, protocol, continuity. Clean words that hide irreversible decisions. This is how profound damage happens without anyone feeling responsible. And here's the warning this case leaves for those watching now. Not all silence needs to be fixed. Some need to be translated. When you force an answer, you can destroy the only structure that kept someone standing. June and Jennifer aren't frightening because they were strange. They're frightening because they show what happens when the world demands normality from those who only survive outside of it. So the final question remains, and it's not about them. It's about us. How many people today are being treated as a problem when all they need is to be understood before being fixed?